The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. These are the words that dare to shake the foundation of economics, and with them, the very fabric of society, our ethics, our politics, and even the way we perceive reality itself. They form the opening lines of what would become the magnum opus of none other than Karl Marx. This book is not simply about money or trade. It's an inquiry into the hidden laws of modern world, the forces that shape our lives in ways we rarely see yet constantly feel. In this series, we'll journey through capital together. We'll uncover the peculiarities Marx points out, the contradictions he reveals in the heart of the bourgeois society, and the radical insights that continue to echo today. 1. Two factors of commodity: use value and value. Marx begins by defining what he means by commodity, which he describes as an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of one sort or another. For example, the microphone that I'm holding right now is a commodity because it satisfies my want of creating this video. So the very fact that it's a commodity is because it has use value. This table is a commodity because it has use value. I can use it to dine on it. However, it's important to note that this is limited by its physical properties. If it wasn't shaped as such, its use value would not have been that of a dining table. If it was a piece of wood, sure, it could be made into a table, but its use at that time is not that of a table. In defining use values, Marx claims that, and I quote, use values become reality only by use or consumption, and that they also constitute the substance of all wealth, end quote. If someone owns a nice car, it's an expression of their wealth. Similarly, if you map this onto a society, the sum of all the commodities of all the people living in a society would constitute the wealth of that society. And since commodities can be exchanged, they constitute the material wealth or material depositories of exchange value. 2. Exchange value. One of the most important relations a commodity can enter is the exchange relation, whereupon it has its initial encounter with its exchange value. Marx asserts that, and I quote, exchange value at first sight presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort, a relation constantly changing with time and place, end quote. Briefly, that at some point in time and place, we might be exchanging X silk for Y cotton, but in another place, we might be exchanging X silk for Y plus 1 cotton. To quote Marx, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value that is, an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms, end quote. Marx asks us to consider the matter a bit more closely. Now, the natural impulse would be to assume that Marx is going to show that it is intrinsic, but that would also be wrong. Instead, what Marx begs us to consider is what the equation 1/4 of corn and 100 weight of iron tells us. Since they are in an equivalent relation, there must be something that exists in equal quantities, something common to both. To quote Marx, exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or lesser quantity, end quote. And since it's capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, they naturally must be reducible to a third. For example, if we were to compare my height, and this comparison can be considered as an example of exchange, we wouldn't measure it up with some other person's weight because they share nothing in common. They are, in Marx's words, incommensurable. They're not properties of the same unit. This common something cannot either be a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. At least as I understand it, it cannot be something that's intrinsic to that commodity, but is intrinsic to all commodities. Now, Marx says that such properties, and he's talking about the properties inherent to a commodity, claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utilities of those commodities, makes them use value. So essentially, when we're not considering something that is an inherent property of that commodity, only then essentially what we're doing is we're abstracting away their use value, making exchange something that takes place without regard to the use value of any commodity. Then one use value is just as good as another, provided only it be present in sufficient quantity. To quote Marx, as use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. End quote. So, what happens when we leave out the consideration in the use value of commodities? What's that common something that every commodity shares? For Marx, that is that they are products of labor. However, the difficulty arises that when we make abstraction from a use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements that make that product a use value. Then it doesn't matter if it's a microphone or a table. What matters is that they are products of labor. Without any regard to the nature of that labor, every commodity is just reduced to being a product of human labor. To quote Marx, along with the useful qualities of products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labors embodied in them and the concrete form of that labor. There is nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, labor in the abstract. End quote. Marx also hints here over at the dual nature of labor, but we're going to talk about that in the next video. For now, our focus is that what's left of commodities in exchange is that they are congealations of homogeneous human labor. That is their value. It's not their use value, it's not their physical form or any other sort of form. It doesn't matter if the microphone is qualitatively more sophisticated than the table. The common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities whenever they are exchanged is their value. Now, the difficulty arises in how do we measure the magnitude of this value? For Marx, it's fairly simple by measuring the quantity of the value creating substance. And how do we measure labor? Well, we can only measure that in time. So, labor time becomes the value of any commodity. Now, this raises some confusion in a lot of people's minds that the more idle any worker is, the more valuable would his commodity be. But Marx does away with this contestation by asserting that, and I quote, the labor that forms the value is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor, end quote. Essentially, the average time it would take a worker in a given society to produce that commodity would become the value of that product. That is, of course, under normal conditions with average skills and intensity. So it doesn't matter if it took me 2 days to make this video. What matters is how long it would take an average worker in my society working under normal conditions with an average degree of skills and intensity. That would be the real value of this video. On a side note, I don't agree with that. I think how long you watch this video for is the real value of my labor. But interestingly, note that even here, we're considering my labor and your time. Marx actually might be onto something. Finally, Karl says, yes, we're on first name basis now. And I quote, a thing can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility to a man is not due to labor, such as air, virgin oil, natural meadows, and etc. A thing can be useful and the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his want with the produce of his own labor creates, indeed, use values, but not commodities. End quote. Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. And for that reason, I want you to like and subscribe. Go on, do it.